Welcome to the Deerfield Theater podcast. In this season, we're talking about Theater D's production of Our Town. In case you're tuning in and didn't already know, Deerfield Theater is putting on a production of Our Town this March and April of 2025. And performances start Friday, March 28th and go through Sunday, April 13th. So while you're listening to this episode, visit the link in the show notes and get your tickets. Without further delay, here's the episode. Well, we're very lucky on Deerfield Theater's podcast to have with us the director of Our Town, Theater D's upcoming performance, Dan Taube. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
So go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, I've been in theater since I was about 12 years old. I started off like many people do as an actor. I went to school for acting in New York. I went to NYU, and then I got my degree in directing from DePaul. Moved back to Chicago for that. And so I was directing for about 30 years. I've been artistic director of a couple different theaters, I've done community theater, I've done professional theater. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided I was almost exclusively on playwriting. So I'm a writer as well. I'm a playwright. I've had some of my works published, and I've had them produced as well. So I had taken a break from directing, but when Our Town came around, I couldn't resist. And so here I am directing another play, directing Our Town, and couldn't be happier.
Well, let's lean into that a little bit. Why is it that you couldn't resist directing Our Town? Why is that the show that brought you back to directing?
Well, couple reasons. One, this show has been with me since I was like 16 years old. I remember reading it as a high school student, not in high school because we didn't read this play. I think we read Death of a Salesman, but somehow it ended up in my hands. Maybe relatives knew I was into theater and, bought the play for me or something like that. And I've come back to the play many, many, many times. And especially as I get older, the play brings in different meanings. It's one of those things. There are works of art where every time you engage with it, it's simply different. It's the same, but you're different. So there's different things that you experience. And I know it to be one of, if not the greatest American play. And I had a little bit of experience with it. There was a high school production where I wasn't directing, but I was brought in to coach one of the actors, the actor playing the stage manager. And I had a lot of fun with that. We were locked in a room for a couple of weeks, so to speak, and I just coached him through the stage manager speeches, and it was a great deal of fun. And I always thought it would be really, really interesting to try to direct.
So just in case people are not familiar with Our Town, as hard as that may be to believe, I'm sure at least half of our audience may be familiar with it in one way or another. But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, there's a lot of theater out there, and
Yeah.
to be fully transparent, because I'm not sure when this episode will air, but I've already said to our listeners that I have not been exposed to Our Town before, and so that's part of the reason I'm very excited
Oh,
about it. Because doing these
interesting.
interviews, I've learned what it's about a little bit doing these interviews, but for folks who have never been exposed to it before, like at a high level, no spoilers, Dan. Like, what's it about?
It is about humanity. That's the thing that makes it so exciting. It is the cycle of life. You follow a very specific town with very specific characters. And when you engage with it, you realize it's about us. It's about it premiered in 1938. And you would think, oh, okay, well, that means, there are things in it that don't relate to today. And it is absolutely not true because it covers the things in life and in humanity that don't change. So we follow these two families through adolescence, into adulthood, into marriage, and I won't tell you what happens in the third act, you really follow the life cycle, and I think there's a lot in there that's relevant to today and is relevant to everybody's experience of life, the ups and the downs, and the hopes and the dreams, and the disappointments and the anguishes, and all of that sort of thing.
This mysterious third act I keep hearing about. It's a great teaser for folks who want to, who want to. It's a through line for these interviews is like, but I won't tell you about the third act. Well, now I'm itching to see it, and I know I could go out there and I could read a treatment or I could read a book about it, but I don't know that I want to. I kind of like want to feel that impact of seeing the story for the first time.
Sure.
Having said that, though, Dan, that does beg the question. If somebody hasn't seen the show, hasn't read the
Mhm.
book,
Right.
Is this something that they should maybe hold on to that and come see the show first and then go look at supplementary and additional material? Where do you stand on
Um,
that kind of ground for our town, and then generally, like if somebody gets to go see a musical for the first time, should they listen to the music, that kind of thing?
I think in general, like me personally, when I go to see a play, I love to be familiar with the play
Hmm.
because for me, it's not about the spoilers and, oh no, I'm going to learn what's going to happen. It's about, it's about the journey. And so I can read a play and go, oh, well, so this happens and then this happens and this happens. And my imagination is curious about, well, how will they do that? Or how will we get there? Or how will this differ from seeing it? How will my experience differ from reading it, versus seeing it? So I think it's great if people inform themselves, read the play, know what's going on. It's not that the third act is such a surprise because when you're in the play, when you're watching it, you kind of know where it's going. There's some indications to it, of what's going to happen. And at a certain point, you can just sort of, I think most of the time, figure it out. But it's just that one, we don't want to tell people what's going to happen.
Hmm.
And two, it's such an astounding finish to a great American play. It's one of the things about our town that I love is that this is, sort of, it's not the beginning of experimental theater in America, but it's the play that introduces so many things that we take for granted today. And some of that shows up in the third act. And, I think in an astounding and theatrical and very, very profound way.
Well, it's great to hear your perspective on introducing oneself to additional materials before seeing a show, in particular
Mhm.
because you are yourself a playwright. And so you're
Yep.
writing these things right now. I want to go back to that. So you studied acting, then
Yep.
directing, and you
Yep.
directed for a long time. Now you're writing. Like, how do each one of those experiences inform the other?
Oh, you know what? They all inform each other because, you know, one will make you stronger than the other. So, like, for instance, I'm really glad that I have the acting and directing background for writing, and vice versa. It's interesting because, theater is a collaborative art. And even when you're a writer, it's still collaborative art, but some of what you have to do is kind of put yourself in a room, close the door, and create this production in your mind. And so it helps to know, all the things about acting and directing and, what's going to, turn on a director or turn them off, or, what's really actable, what's not. And understanding that as a director, understanding how a play works, understanding how actors work, that's all incredibly important.
And from the playwright's perspective, I'm curious to know, having directed shows and acting, like the
Yeah.
actors make choices, directors
Right.
make choices and interpretations. So when you're writing, a play, are you thinking about, oh, I wonder how this will be interpreted, or are you like, no, this is the interpretation I'm going for?
Absolutely. That's the exciting part to me as a writer because I had my first experience with getting a play of mine directed. There were a lot of people that were like, "Don't you want to direct it yourself?" And I was like, "No, that's the fun part, is because I've written it. I know what I think about it, but I want to see what somebody else thinks about it, and that's part of the exciting part about seeing one of your plays being directed by somebody else. So, yeah, 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 it's quite interesting.
So maybe one of our younger listeners hears your story and they're like, oh, well, maybe I want to be a playwright one day. So first I should
Mhm.
act, first I should direct. Did you have a grand plan in mind, Dan, when you ended up where you were? Or was it more of a windy path?
It everything is sort of synchronicity. I did not have a grand plan. All I knew about theater when I was growing up was acting,
Mhm.
because that's mostly what you're exposed to when you get involved in high school theater. There's some tech, but I mean, you want to be on stage, you want to experience that. And I love acting and I love theater. And, I went into school for it. And then I sort of learned how, well, when you're an actor, very much it becomes about how other people see you, and that controls the type of roles that you get and what you're doing in the theater. And I love the idea in directing that you could choose something. You get to choose the material you work on. I was very idealistic. I realize a lot of times directors don't choose, but in my mind, as a 19, 20-year-old, I was like, well, this is great. I can choose the play that I want to work on. and I can choose how it's interpreted and how the audience sees it and how I work with the actors and all of that. And so that was one thing. And I did that, like I said, for many, many years. And then, I got to a point where artistically I wasn't sure what my voice was. And I'd always wanted to be a writer. I'd always admired writers. I had been a full-time theater teacher for about 10 years. And for one reason or another, I decided, my time with that was over. And I wasn't retired, but I had all this time on my hands. And I was like, what do you want to do? And I just thought, I want to write. I want to sit down. I want to try it. And it was a lot more difficult and a lot more challenging and a lot more fun than I ever imagined it would be.
The teacher thing brings a whole other dynamic because there is that saying, or like coaches, about coaches too, like if you can't play, you coach, if you can't do, you teach. But what I've found, being the recipient of mentorship and being a mentor as well, is that sometimes when you teach, it actually informs your own experience and makes you better at what you do. So did you find that was true when you were teaching theater?
Amazingly so. Absolutely. You do learn from your students all the time. Like I said, I like to be very collaborative, and that's no different when you're working with students, because maybe some people approach high school theater differently, but I always felt like the students had a lot to offer in the interpretation, and in the presentation of their characters and all of that. And so I would collaborate with them. But one of the reasons why I taught wasn't, if you can't, you teach, blah, 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 blah. It was really, I had so many great teachers in my training, and coming up as a young adult, that I felt I had all of these lessons that had been taught to me, had been passed to me. And I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to pass them on, because I thought, sometimes people get involved in theater and they don't necessarily go into professionally, but there's no reason why they shouldn't have a professional perspective that will help them enjoy life and help them enjoy theater that much more.
And that's really one of the through lines of this podcast is there's such back and forth between quote unquote the real world and the theater world. Now, of course, for
Yeah.
you, that's been one and the same in all these different roles that you've had. But like you mentioned, not all students, not all actors, not all directors, whatever, will stay in that world all the
100%.
time,
Right.
and yet there are these lessons. So sort of like how our town, you learn lessons from going to see the show. Again,
Oh
we're trying to
yeah.
put butts in seats here, about life. Even from learning about theater, from performing in theater, you have takeaways to take out into the non-stage world. What
Yeah.
has been your experience that you've seen, whether it's been, contemporaries of yours, students of yours, even if they're not in theater professionally, take into the real world?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. There's so many things. One of the things that first comes to mind is a lot of people live their lives, especially now, in solitude, staring at their screens, cut off from other people. And you can't do that in theater. You have to learn how to be part of a team. You have to learn how to work with others. And you have to do it in a situation or a dynamic where no one person is more important than anybody else. And that includes the director and the producer and the playwright. Nobody is more important than anybody else. Everybody has something valuable to contribute, and you can't close yourself off. You can't sit in the corner if you're shy, which a lot of people that come into theater are shy. I was, still am sometimes, a bit of an introvert, but you can't do that. You can't. You have to engage with other people. You have to talk. You have to share. You have to open yourself up. And I think that's incredibly valuable for the real world, and there is a lesson that we get from our town that I think, plays into that, which is the biggest lesson from our town is how precious life is and how fragile it is and how little we sometimes really, really appreciate it, and that means you need to make the most of every experience. And so a play, is finite. There's an end date. You're only going to be working, it's not like creating a painting, painting a painting, or recording a song. It will exist and it will be played and it will be seen. The play that, production, that doesn't happen. Well, sure, that happens with plays that are written, but the production has an end date and you have to make the most of your experience. And hopefully at the end, you'll have no regrets. I didn't do this enough or I didn't do that enough. You really put yourself into it, put yourself out there. And that's an important lesson for living life.
Yeah, this talk of, important lessons like that, where it reminds me of the pandemic, where we didn't
Oh,
have, I mean, we didn't have a choice but to be siloed or to be with our partner if we had, a partner or somebody or family or, during that time. And all we had were our screens, which now
right.
helps us appreciate, going to live theater, doing things in person, not being siloed. But then tell us, Dan, what was your experience like being so steeped in this world when the pandemic happened?
Well, I'm gonna go backwards in time. So the thing is the last play I directed before this one was a play called Harvey by Mary Chase, and it's a popular play. Probably a lot of people will know this play, but when I was hired to do it, the pandemic was still going on. It was things were loosening up. So it was very interesting because the first couple weeks of rehearsal we did entirely virtual. The auditions were entirely virtual, and that's a completely different world than anything that I had experienced before. It's just different. You have to make different types of choices and to be honest, the first couple of weeks of doing it virtually was actually kind of fun because I could rehearse and not leave my apartment. I didn't have to commute. I didn't have to pay for gas. As the theater was actually a fair amount away from my home, but I was obviously thrilled when we were able to start doing it in person. And there were still people getting sick and, needing to wear masks and all that kind of stuff. So that was sort of my experience at the end of the pandemic. Was I did have this play I was working on, and it was a completely unusual experience for me directing a play while the pandemic was going on. But the thing about when the pandemic hit was I had just started writing. I had been writing for a couple of years, and as a new writer, I was experiencing. I was getting my feet wet with like staged readings and and readings in general, and going into public and hearing your play read and hearing people have their comments about your play, and all of a sudden the opportunities that I had were limited. I was actually supposed the week that it hit, I was supposed to have one of my plays read at a theater, and they closed down. They shut down business, and the play never got read. So it was, obviously that was disappointing to me, but all of a sudden people started to reinvent how to do theater, and I did experience a lot, virtually over the time period of the pandemic. And some of it was, like I said, it was really it was fascinating. It was neat. It was a different way of experiencing it. But I think I speak for everybody that after 3 or 4 years, we'd had enough,
Yeah.
and it was such a joy and it was so wonderful when the theaters opened up again and you could start to like, see your collaborators in person and, really experience theater in that way, in the way that we were used to. So It was it was a it was a whole bunch of different experiences that I don't think I would trade because it was valuable and it taught me a lot, but it was very, very joyful when the pandemic was over and we could go back to business as usual.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we've had a writer on the show yet, even though we're like almost 50 episodes into this thing. And I other than the collaborative part of like hearing your play read aloud in person and feel that emotion and stuff, I have to imagine not being able to go anywhere is actually maybe good for writing because you have nothing else to do. So is that a good part at least?
It was. Yeah, you can't there's not a lot of places where you could go, and so sometimes you're sort of stuck in Rome going, what should I do? Well, I think I'll write a play. And as a beginning playwright, you write a lot of short plays. You write a lot of 1 minute plays, 10-minute plays. And so I could take an afternoon and shoot out a play and go, this is what I did with my day. This was productive. So that was actually a very fun part of the pandemic is being
And,
able
and
to
then
do.
Yeah, yeah, and that's actually I think a really other important lesson is especially as I speak with more and more younger people who maybe they want to start a business or have an idea or write a play where they think it has to be perfect. Like this next thing that I create, whatever it is, needs to be perfect and last forever, but there's value in iteration and like learning from just doing something, right?
Well, I mean, that is what, if you were to look at acting and directing and playwriting side by side, that is one of the things that they share, which is you can't be perfect. You can
Mhm.
It's never going to start out perfectly. There are questions and there are, you know, strategies, and it's like you go into it and you go, I have to be okay with this not being perfect right out of the gate. But I have a vision. Again, if you are, it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're a designer, you're a director, you're a playwright, you're an actor, you have a vision of what you want it to be. And there's a process and there's a journey towards achieving that. And I think it would be incredibly boring if we just showed up and we had everything figured out and that's just what it was going to be. You learn things. You learn things about the material, you learn things about yourself, learn things about yourself with the material, and that's part of the joy of creating theater.
Speaking of the joy of creating theater, to wrap up the interview here with a couple of fun questions we always like to ask all our guests, Dan, is you've been involved with theater for a really long time, decades and decades. We're not going to make you pick your single favorite, but if you could pick a handful of favorites over the years that you've been in some form or another, like what are those shows and why?
Okay, I'm going to pick three. And the first two are plays that I've directed. I guess the first time that I had what would be termed a success as a director was a play called In the Boom Boom Room by David Rabe. And it was set in the 1970s. We were doing it in the 90s, but it was a play about, women's role in America. And the interesting thing about it was we were doing a period piece, and it just looked like things hadn't had changed as much as they should have,
Mhm.
and so it was an experience that was not only, enjoyable for me and gratifying for me, but I had audience members that were like, thank you for doing this play. Thank you for directing and producing this play. And I got so much out of it. And that was incredibly, incredibly valuable experience for me. Another play I directed was called The Marriage of Bet and Boo by Christopher Durang. And that was it was more of a straight out comedy, which was obviously a lot of fun, but it was about a crazy dysfunctional family. And having grown up in that environment, I felt that as an artist, there was a lot that I had to say about the play and about the experiences of the characters. And that was also very, very gratifying to me. And it was one of my favorite plays, one of my favorite writers. Same thing with David Rabe and In the Boom Boom Room. When you read a play and you fall in love with it, and then you just get this idea in your head of like, well, this is what it would be like if it was put on stage. And lastly, it was powerful and incredibly rewarding to me the first time that I saw one of my works actually produced, in a Chicago theater and directed by somebody else, as I referenced, and it was a very personal play. It was a play about a character that was essentially me back between the ages of 19 and 22, and to sort of go into those experiences and look at that from the perspective of today and then present that on a stage and have people respond to it was very rewarding.
You want to tell us what the name of it was?
Oh, I'm sorry. The name of the play was Monster Girl. And so the main character is a female, but it is somebody that when they're a child, what they have for their friends and for solace and for comfort is this world of the imagination. This character loves monsters, and so when they felt themselves bullied or picked on, they would imagine the monsters were there to help them. And what would Dracula do? What would Frankenstein's monster do? And as you get older, the monsters become not so friendly and they start in real life, there are real monsters. And
Mhm.
that was sort of the journey of the play. But yes, Monster Girl was the name of the play.
Well, Monster Girl might also be an answer to this last question that I'll ask you, which is
Mm,
when you're not, directing or acting and you're just sitting in the audience and enjoying a show, what have
mhm.
been some of the favorite shows that you've been to just as an audience member over the years?
Oh, there's so many. There really are so many. There was a production of Merchant of Venice at the Goodman Theater, directed by Peter Sellers, that, similar to our town, was so interesting because they removed the scenery and the costumes were all. It's not just they were modern dress; they were just very common. It's almost like there was no. There was a costume design, but it was very, very, very subtle, And so as an audience member, you really got to use your imagination, and it helped me to see the play in a way that I had never seen the play before. It was fascinating to me. For the Goodman, that was a play that a lot of people walked out on because their subscribers were used to lots of scenery and wigs and fancy costumes and all that. But I loved it. I thought it was great. And the play that changed my perspective on what theater could be and even made me think that someday I might want to be a director was back in 1984 and 1985. Robert Falls, who was the artistic director of Goodman Theater, was working with a theater called Wisdom Bridge, and they did Hamlet. And going to see Hamlet, the entire production was fantastic. There was a scene where they used Burning Down the House by the Talking Heads, which in conjunction with Shakespeare was great. For my 18-year-old self, I was like, this is so cool. But the really interesting thing was the play begins and there's nothing on stage but a coffin. And so you're in the audience and the coffin begins to shake, and it begins to shake, and eventually blood spills out of the coffin and covers the stage. And as a young theater student, I was like, I didn't know you could do that. That's like something in a movie. I didn't know you could do that on stage. And it was very exhilarating for me as an audience member. And I'll never forget it.
Wow. Yeah, no, that sounds incredibly impactful. Well,
Yeah.
with that, and an excellent job, bringing it back to our town with the answer to this question, because my last, the final takeaway here is if people are not convinced to go get their tickets, which, by the way, if you're listening to this or watching it, link in the show notes to go buy your tickets, deerfieldtheater.com. This is your last opportunity, at least on this podcast episode. Why should people come see our town?
That's a good question. And I would go back to something that I've said was that it is about the cycle of life. There is literally something in this for everybody. If you love drama, it has it. If you love comedy, it has it. And it follows the experience, like I said, of human beings from childhood onward. And I think everybody will find something to relate to. It's incredibly, incredibly relevant all the time. And one of my selling points for our town is that this is such a great play that it is being done somewhere in the world every single day. There are a few plays you can say that about, but our town is the one that literally somebody is always doing this play, and that speaks to how important, how relevant, and how valid it is as a work of art, not just as a work of theater. So come see it. You will not be disappointed. You will be thrilled. And yeah, you'll just really enjoy it.
Sounds great. Well, since you are writing, you are a playwright, I wonder if if folks are interested in following your work or staying in touch, or if there's like a website or a social media handle. Is there anything you want to share like that with the listeners?
I don't have anything like that right now. The place where I have my plays posted is on a site called New Play Exchange, but that's a site you need a subscription for. So, I could do a commercial for them and say, hey, if you like reading plays, you want to read new plays by undiscovered writers, go to New Play Exchange, and it's like $12 a year, and you will get so much to read. And you can just look up my name, Dan Taube, and all my plays are there.
Well, I think that's a great deal. I don't think that's a big ask for people,
No,
not a sponsor of the show, but $1 a month to like read, plays from, not yet widely known writers. I think that's a very cool thing to share. So thank you for sharing that, Dan. Well, once again, Dan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
it was great to be here.
And that's our show. Please share this podcast to help support the work of Deerfield Theater. An even better way to support us is to go see our town. To purchase tickets, visit deerfieldtheater.com or click the link in the show notes. Thank you to the production staff and cast for our town. Please follow us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred listening app to never miss an episode. Until next time, thanks to everyone who continues to support the arts. We'll see you at the theater.